Hello and welcome to the Green Justice Podcast. I'm your co-host, Greg Simmons, and I'm joined by my esteemed co-hosts, Paula Hirschman.
Who's laughing?
Sorry. Hi.
There she is. And our other co-host, and also for this episode, interview guest, Mark Vardy.
Hello. Hi, everybody.
Yeah, so we were just talking about how Mark wants to rock out.
Well, the intro music that you composed it's so lovely. It is really lovely in all aspects. But I feel like so many of the topics that, are of relevance to green justice are terrible things happening in the environment and in the ecological sphere that, entail anger or provoke anger,
Right.
let's say. And so I was thinking, like, we maybe need like a little bit of a punk intro as well.
Like a hardcore kind of anthem, right?
Yeah.
Justice.
Something like that.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah. Well, we could try some different.
Or we can just try to like inject punk into the topic. All right. On the topic of punk, Paula, you have some questions?
What?
Well, isn't that a natural segue?
On the topic of punk, Paula.
Well, like,
Wow.
if you were to line the three of us up against a wall and say, ask a random person to pick out the punk,
Right.
they'd probably pick you out.
Would they?
I think so. Don't
Elaborate. Elaborate, Mark. Justify that comment. By all means.
Greg and I look like square middle-aged white guys, and you look like a radical feminist punk.
Yeah, way to go, Mark, commenting on a woman's appearance.
Right.
Oh,
right
God.
at the outset.
Yeah, edit this out.
Yeah.
You also ask hard-nosed, hard-hitting questions.
I do. Critical orientation, right?
Exactly. And that was more what I was referring to rather
Of
than
course. As opposed to the appearance.
your appearance.
Yeah, it's not the appearance. It's my ideology, right?
Well, we could talk about that, right? Like, what is the relation between ideology and appearance, aesthetics? Like, is the realm of aesthetics like signifying, Dick Hebdige, right? Like the signification.
Probably for most, unless you're like
subcultures of style.
A paradox exist as a paradox. Therefore, there is a disconnect.
Yeah, it's also kind of emblematic of our age, right? In which places an emphasis on
Now,
self-expression.
when you say our age, do you mean like our age, or do you mean like the age in which we live, like
the epoch?
The
epoch.
But obviously, age is a factor, right? Because Mark, even though he used to be, the coolest punk on the block, I'm sure.
That was never me. I was never the coolest punk on the block.
We think of, and even in terms of politics and social change and so on, in terms of like individual self-expression a lot. So that becomes almost like a substitute, I think. I mean, it's great in itself, but I think it does also become a substitute for the fact that we have so little actual
Mark is hovering over the board.
Button.
No. I'm just like
that trombone.
I'm wondering which. It could go either way. It depends on how you finish the sentence. Like, are you going to finish the sentence so that we hear this?
That's not point.
Is that what we're going to hear, or are we going to hear this at the end of your sentence?
Probably. Yeah, that's going to get a lot of use. Okay, my point is, it's kind of the myth of politics is kind of self-expression, right? As opposed to actual political connection, of which, unfortunately, we have very little, which ties into the theme of the show. Right. So you see, it all comes together.
Bringing it back around.
Wow.
I think that is the particular genius of this particular podcast. It doesn't matter which direction we run in, we can always bring it around
Yeah.
to the central
Yeah.
theme. Well done, Greg.
Well, don't you agree that, or do you?
You know, what you said makes
It
sense.
does. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Should we discuss the official topic of the day, which is our esteemed co-host, Mark Vardy, has an exciting book out, which is co-editor on science and technology studies and climate change in particular, climate science. But I know Paul are having, being the studious and dedicated person that she is, has actual specific questions. But do you want to start by maybe telling us a little bit about the book?
Sure. Be happy to. Thank you. So it's called Climate Science and Society, a Primer. It comes out of a workshop that I attended at the University of Southern Indiana in Evanston, Indiana in 2022. We were brought together by one of the main editor on this book, Stephen Zier, who got a National Science Foundation grant to put this workshop on, and basically bringing together scholars who work in science and technology studies and climate change with the intention to actually produce something like this, which is a collection of short, easy to read. We tried to make the chapters as short and as accessible as possible, not in a kind of a textbooky manner, but more in like a hey, here's like an interesting range of topics and approaches that people in this field are taking currently. So a lot of the authors, there's 37 chapters in this book. A lot of the authors were participants in that original workshop. We also invited others. And the purpose of each chapter is not to give like a comprehensive overview of any one particular topic as you might find in a textbook, but rather just to give a interesting slice or window into, the various different areas that you can explore when taking the lens of science technology studies to climate change.
Awesome.
Yeah. Thank you. And then
All right, well, thank you.
It was a really fun. It was
coming in. It sounds super interesting. And as you say, like a window into climate change and science and technology studies. Maybe you could tell us a bit more about that, because I think, people think of science and technology, a lot of people have perhaps like preset notions of what science is, how it works, what it tells us, that may be linked to kind of this idea of an objective and kind of given, absolute way of understanding things. Oh, on the other hand, now, of course, we see a lot of skepticism around science. We see the proliferation of like conspiracy theories, especially around topics like global warming, and people coming up with all kinds of ideas around what's going on.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
so on.
No, I can try to give a sort of a brief overview, I guess, of science and technology studies, which really grew out of the attempt in the 1970s, I would say. And it happened sort of simultaneously in a couple different areas where sociologists and anthropologists got interested in the work that scientists do to produce scientific facts. So instead of treating science as if it has this almost, mythical ability to produce a capital T truth, the sociologists and anthropologists got interested in looking at the work of science the same way that you might look at any other group, right? In terms of their rituals, their daily practices, the tools they use, their way of making meaning with one another, and of interacting with the environment around them. And so you have a range of different approaches, I think, and there's like various debates within science technology studies about the practicality of each approach. But basically, what they're sort of united by is this attempt to see scientific practice more as like a local and situated activity, and then tracing the outputs of science into how they get taken up in the wider world outside of the laboratory. Because science does have a curious place in Western society, right? Where it is associated with power and in very kind of intimate ways. such that if you frame things in a scientific manner, then it's perceived as having more legitimacy or more authority. And so that's why when you have people who are skeptical of, intervening into the market, say, to try to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, they may be motivated by an ideological argument, right? Because they don't want to have government intervention into a free market. But based on that ideological position, they will frame their argument in terms of the science, because they know that if you can discredit the science, then you can also discredit the idea that we should be acting on that science in society to make changes, right? And but the reason why that has proven to be a very successful strategy for them to take is because of the social authority of science, right? The way in which science is typically taken to uphold a kind of a universal truth, let's say. So science and technology studies is kind of interesting because it goes behind the scenes, right? It goes backstage and it looks at how what gets taken to be scientific facts are worked up in the first place. And so there's some people who would say, well, that's lending ammunition, say, to those who want to discredit science, because you're basically showing the socially constructed aspect of it. But the response to that, I think, is, well, actually, and this is drawing directly from one of the main proponents of science technology studies, Bruno Latour, that you're actually adding reality to it because you're actually showing how scientists arrive at their conclusions through their interactions with the material world, right? And so you're basically seeing scientists bump up against the material world, which is very, has this kind of intransigence. It has a kind of ability to exert itself back on to the scientists when they go to bump up against it by, conducting experiments or what have you. And then that form of intransigence, or that what some would call agency, then gets translated through scientific practice into the output. Yeah. So what I like about this approach is that it kind of demystifies science, and it also shows, especially when thinking about climate change, the vast proliferation of the different scientific disciplines that go into understanding climate change, all the way from terrestrial ecosystem biologists to oceanographers to sea ice specialists to people who are looking at atmospheric chemistry to the computer modelers of different scales. I mean, there's just like a huge range of different disciplines that contribute to our understanding of climate change. But as a sociologist using this approach, one of the things that I find interesting is how those disciplines then communicate with one another, interact with one another, and go through that process of going from their own local, situated, particular knowledges into something that is taken as being more universal.
Right.
So,
Yeah,
sorry, I
that's a
tried to be
lot to
brief, but I can ramble, nonstop.
No, there's so much there. Yeah, so you're saying the science is a social process, right? And that I guess the a central idea is moving away from this, like you say, this notion of science and scientific process existing at a remove from society, right? Which is always by necessity, like
Yeah. I,
artificial, but I think is ingrained. It's kind of that big,
I think there's a dichotomy.
classical.
I think sorry to Greg, I'm just going to interrupt. I think like there's a real dichotomy that people often pose where they see science and religion as like these two kind of like, they see science and say God, right? And like as these two sort of opposing ways of understanding, truth, the nature of existence, reality, etc. And it's almost like in doing that, in posing these two kind of dichotomous ways, science and religion, people will assume that science, it has the same status, right? As it has as this kind of grand, all-knowing, omniscient,
Yeah.
objective, enduring, ahistorical kind of status as the Christian God, for example, when it doesn't. It's science is a human activity. It's a product of humans. And because it's human activity, it's fallible, right? Like scientists make mistakes just the same as, like guy making your sandwich might make a mistake. That's maybe a bad example, but science, I think, is best seen as a craft.
Right. And it's also like contested, right? Like the process of scientific change and scientific development. Again, we have this perhaps positivistic notion of like this accretion of knowledge, this like where you're building on what comes before in this linear way. But in fact, it can be an actual process where there's resistance, where the kind of social dynamic and politics of it as well
Oh, for sure.
kind of are built in, right? And people might, die on a hill of ascribing to a particular scientific view, even though the weight of evidence, if you will, even though like a new paradigm or something has emerged,
Yes.
that's because they're embedded in social reality. So yes, but perhaps Paula, you would like to jump in. I feel like I'm hugging the question.
No, that's okay. It's gone in a good direction, I think. As you were talking, Mark, I just kept thinking about Bruno Latour's work, and even like this deeper divide between nature and culture, right, as being kind of the epitome of that kind of Cartesian dualism that we think of and that drives this understanding of science and what it is. But in addition to being an editor of this work, you are also one of the contributors. So another thing that you could talk about is perhaps your very own chapter.
Well, sure, Paula. I'd be happy to do that. And and I'm glad you mentioned that nature culture divide, right? And I think that is also totally fundamental to science and technology studies, or STS, is trying to see the way in which that very concept of this dichotomy between nature and culture, science and society is in fact just like how it's both kind of informed modernity and how it's also just so run its course, right? Like it is just it is a concept that just needs to be, it's just exhausted, I think, but it still seems to have like a zombie-like quality. Anyways, okay. Do you want me to talk about the chapter in this book?
If you'd like, or you can continue talking about this notion perhaps of hybrids, right? This indistinction between nature and culture and the proliferation of hybrids. Go delve deep into Bruno Latour's work.
I don't think we want to hear that.
No.
We should ask David Sadoway that question.
Yeah, we should.
Okay, so in this chapter, I don't know if it's entirely successful, to be honest, but what I was trying to do. So I did research with the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and with several colleagues, interviewed the scientists and social scientists who volunteer as IPCC authors as they were going through the process of writing the sixth assessment report, which, despite having a singular name, it's actually comprised of many different reports.
Could you maybe, sorry, just to jump in, because I think people may have heard of the IPCC and they may not know really what it is and what these kind of international processes are.
Right. Okay, so the IPCC, it was formed by the UN, specifically the United Nations Environmental Program and the World Meteorological Association in 1988, when climate change was on the radar and on the agenda of many global leaders. So people may not know, but Margaret Thatcher spoke about climate change. George W. Bush, he spoke about climate change. And both Thatcher and Bush, they did a little bit of podium thumping, saying that they were going to take climate change seriously. George W. Bush is quoted as saying, people who talk about the greenhouse effect haven't heard about the White House effect, right? So back in the late 80s, right, like climate change, it was on the agenda. It was like a sort of a peak in terms of, like there's scholars who have looked at the amount of news reporting and the kind of news reporting, the type of news reporting that has been given to climate change. And at that point in history, there was a peak. Anyways, so coming out of that, there is a demand for what we could think of as like a science advice organization by government leaders. And so the United Nations Environmental Program and the World Meteorological Association together formed the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So it's formed as a UN agency with 195 countries who have signed on. And they are tasked with producing periodic assessments of the most up-to-date peer-reviewed science. And they are furthermore tasked with assessing the science in such a way that they can then advise policymakers, and they're asked to be policy neutral but policy relevant. So they're not supposed to be prescriptive. They're not supposed to tell policymakers what to do, but they're supposed to summarize the science and assess the science in such a way that is useful for policymakers who want to then act on it. So when we hear about like the big international conferences, right? Like every year there's the Conference of the Parties or the COP, and this is where global leaders will fly in, and there'll be big speeches, and there'll be a lot of media attention, and there'll be, international negotiations to try to come to some agreement to limit the amount of greenhouse gases or deal with the impacts which are already being seen. And the IPCC is the organization that is basically providing the science advice that underpins these negotiations. So the project that I joined, we began interviews in 2018 when their sixth assessment cycle started, and we just wrapped it up. I guess the last observations that I made was in 2023, and that's at the meeting that I report in this chapter. And so over that period of time, over those 5 years, there is this collection of about 700 to 800 scientists divided into 3 working groups, and they were all working on reviewing the state of the science and producing these assessment reports specifically for government policymakers. Yeah, and so people may also be familiar with the IPCC when you hear media reports around, oh, we've only got 12 years left to act, or the 1.5 degree target, if we want trying to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, and there's like a UN agency that has come out with a report that says we've only got 12 years. Like that was a big kind of media cycle around that story. And so, so the IPCC is the organization that people are referring to in those stories.
Right. It's even in your describing that, it strikes me as somewhat ironic, right? That you have this body that is supposed to, like, after we've just been talking about how science doesn't have this actually fully objective, if you will, or independent nature from politics even, right? That you have the scientific panel that is deemed to be like the fully independent of the political process,
it's
right? That there is
governmental,
this
right?
separation.
It's right in the name. It's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And this is one of the reasons why people find it so interesting to study, is because of the way in which the boundaries between science and politics are negotiated throughout the process and in different ways, right? And so there's a variety of different opinions that scholars have on this. People take different, make different arguments. So there'll be people who disagree with my interpretation of this. But broadly speaking, you can say either that there should be a separation of science and politics, and that therefore we should try to structure these processes so that that separation is purified and maintained and policed. Or you can say it'd be a fool's errand to try to separate science and politics because they're already so closely intermeshed anyways. So what we should do is think about how we can make distinctions between good science, right, and bad science, and good politics and bad politics. But the IPCC itself is such an interesting venue to explore these questions because of the way that politics enters into the picture in both formal and acknowledged ways, and also in unacknowledged and informal ways throughout the process. So can I give you an example?
Yeah, I was just going to ask for one. Yeah.
Okay. So I keep on mentioning like the sixth assessment cycle. And so basically, since the IPCC started it was formed in 1988, but it didn't really start its work until 1990. And then since then it's produced a report every, on average, like 5 to 7 years. Oh, okay. And so at the
Right.
very beginning of each new assessment cycle, and the reason they do that is because there's always new science being produced. People are always learning things, and science, climate change itself, is a moving target, right? Because we're continuing to emit greenhouse gas emissions, and so the situation itself is dynamic. So there's a need for continually updating our knowledge about it. And so at the beginning of every new cycle, there's a process by which governmental representatives, along with key figures in the IPCC, in the Bureau, in the Secretariat, come together to agree on an outline of what should be included in the assessment report that's going to unfold over the next several years. Governments will have a process, and it varies a little bit from one country to the next. But basically, each country will go through its own process to select their spokesperson, right? The person who's going to participate in these negotiations on their behalf. So those governmental representatives, along with IPCC scientists, will collectively decide through a process of negotiation that results in a kind of consensus on what the outline will be. And it's a very detailed outline. So it includes the title of each chapter as well as a bulleted list of items that they expect to be included in each chapter. As I've mentioned, there's 3 different working groups. Each working group produces its own report of about 15,000 pages. 1,500 pages. So you have 3 reports, each about 1,500 pages long, each of which is, anywhere between 12 to 17 or 18 chapters. And so all of that is specified in a quite detailed outline. It is then passed over to the volunteer scientists, right? And at that point, the governmental representatives have no more participation in the process. It's passed over to the volunteer scientists who take that outline and say, okay, here's what is deemed to be relevant to policymakers. Now we're going to review the science that helps inform this, right? So they then spend 2 years. In the case we looked at, that was extended because of the pandemic. But at any rate, they spend several years producing the assessment that fulfills the outline given at the initial outset. They then take those 1,500 pages for each of the working groups and produce a much smaller, shorter summary for policymakers, which is typically about 30 to 40 pages. And that 30 to 40 page document then goes back to the panel, which has all of these governmental representatives on it. And that much shorter document has to get approved line by line, sentence by sentence, by everybody in the room. That is the process that I am covering in this chapter in this book, right? Is like that, the last final meeting of this huge, long process where the IPCC scientists are taking their final summary, right, their final 30-page document back to the government representatives and saying, here is a summary of everything that we have found out in the last couple of years. And then that document gets projected onto the screen, right, in this it's like a big auditorium, several hundred people. And they highlight the sentence that they're looking at. They highlight it in yellow. And then they start talking about it, right? And if any governmental representative wants to raise an objection about any part of that sentence, a word or phrasing or an implication, then they can do so. And the rules of procedure state that it doesn't get signed off until every party in the room can agree to it. So at that point, you have like this incredibly long process of going like, and it's like, lawyers wrangling over the wording. And so there you see, politics kind of like coming back into it. In the sense of like governmental representatives, right? But then also while they're ostensibly trying to clarify the language, right? Like that's the whole given purpose of this exercise, is so that the governmental representatives can, ensure the relevance of the document, but also clarify points that policymakers may find confusing. But while that's the kind of like the ostensible purpose, you can also see how nation states, governmental representatives are arguing for wording that seems to benefit them.
Right.
Can you maybe
Under the guise of some kind of, objective, still within like the ostensible framework of this is about, policy. This is about clarifying meaning and so on. But in reality, the implicit politics has got to be there. It's got to be quite a process. I mean, just the process, if you've ever like co-written stuff with people, like on a small level with a few people, I've seen some images and clips and that of the actual process, but it's kind of amazing to me that it actually comes, that it works at all.
Yeah. Well, it's
But
amazing to lots of people. There's always like a huge feeling of relief in the room when the document gets like when the chair bangs the gavel to sign the whole thing off. And it's like, okay, there's a huge feeling of relief. And I should actually correct myself. I made it sound as if there's only one governmental representative from each country participating in this process. But in fact, there's like delegations, right? And so different countries will have different size delegations. Some countries
right.
will not have any delegation. During the pandemic, many of these approval sessions were moved online, right? And so that was really interesting because you would see where people were zooming in from. And I forget which nation it was, but it was a small island state in the Caribbean who are particularly susceptible to increased sea level rise.
Yeah.
And so they have a lot of stake, right, at this because they argue strenuously against any kind of like any fraction. They would argue that any fraction of a degree of global warming is an existential threat. And their governmental representatives, when they go on Zoom, you see this basically like a ministerial bureaucrat, right, in their office. And you just see, wow, okay, so here is someone who's like zooming in. They've got like a bunch of other things that they've also got to do as part of their regular day. And they are also trying to ensure that this impoverished nation is weighing in into this document such that the effects of climate change are recorded, right? And the potential impacts on livelihoods and on lives of the people in this country are recorded. Meanwhile, this person, this kind of, like they may be a senior policy analyst, but they're still coming from a country that doesn't have many resources, right? But at the same time, you then see other countries who have lots of resources. Maybe those resources come from the fossil fuel industry. And maybe they have like lots of people who can attend their delegations or be part of their delegation. Anyways.
It reminds me a bit of trade agreements, like the negotiations around, the WTO and international trade agreements where you see the same dynamic, right? You see like it's really kind of a microcosm of geopolitics, right? Where you see the wealthy North, the global North countries, the wealthy capitalist countries just sending these delegations, teams of high-powered lawyers, and then you've got, somebody from, developing world countries, like one person who's yet doing it, like with no funding and trying to, negotiate for their interests. And they're the ones, like that's they're representing the place that's gonna get
Hammered,
screwed, basically.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's kind of analogy.
And so can I just say one more thing? Sorry.
Yeah.
Did you have another question?
No, I was just going to ask you to unpack all those kind of motivations and politics involved. So you already on that trail. Go ahead.
Well, the one thing I want to say is like, and the point I was trying to make in this chapter is like all of this. Some people would say the IPCC is inherently political, and it's inherently conservative because of this way of negotiating the summary for policymakers, right? Where any country can say, I object to this particular wording and then like hold out until they gain concessions. And so some people would find that reason to dismiss the whole enterprise. What I say is like, no, the IPCC is actually very useful. I think it still is. There's a lot of good to it. But what we have to recognize is the way in which national self-interest just overdetermines so much about not just the IPCC, but the world in which we live, right? Like this particular way of dividing up space on the earth, right, into the sovereign nation state, which we know had a particular historical emergence in Western Europe around, some scholars pick the Treaty of Westphalia in
Right.
1648 or whatever. But there's a whole way of dividing up space that into the nation state, and the way in which power then accrues within the state to facilitate at the same time colonial imperial expansion and capitalist expansion, right, into what we now think of as globalization. But the nation state and the self-interest of the nation state, it is, I think, a limiting factor when it comes to the politics of responding to climate change. And that, I think, is something that we really need to start confronting, right? Because when you look at the kinds of dynamics that are implicated in climate change that is going to be coming down the road, I think we need to have new forms of organizing, new forms of connecting, new forms of cooperating across and within, territories demarked by the sovereign nation state. And so that's kind of like this thing that I try to gesture to at the very end of this chapter. The other thing that I try to gesture to is that the underlying reports, right, those 1,500 long page reports, contain a wealth of information that is like super interesting, super detailed, and quite, in many cases, progressive, because they have not been subjected to the same line by line editing, right? So there in those
Right.
underlying reports, you have the IPCC authors engaging with the actual literature, right? And it's not just the
Right.
science, but there's also a lot of social science, right? Of those three working groups, only the first one is strictly the physical sciences, right? And then working group two is impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. So there you have social scientists like sociologists, health specialists, anthropologists, people who study global development, historians, all across the social sciences, but also working with scientists to look at how climate change is having an impact both regionally and then also sectorally. And then working group three is where you find primarily economists, because working group three is where you find the work on mitigation. So there you find the work on modeling different economic scenarios with different forecasted futures of various climate emission scenarios. So,
Right.
so all that to say, there's like a ton of actual social science as well that is in
Right.
those reports, which is very interesting.
Which again is like people think of climate, they probably think of physical science. They don't
Yeah.
see necessarily that interconnection.
Well, I kept doing the air quotes when you were referring to the science, right? I'm like, well, can you unpack that? What
Oh,
is this science that you speak of, right?
yeah. Yeah. And that just goes through the whole difficulty of this, right? Is because it's like, yeah, there is, like, as I mentioned at the very beginning, an immense proliferation, right, of different sciences. So
Yeah.
it's not a capital S science, right?
Yeah.
There's many small S sciences.
And there is no scientific method either, right? Like
Yeah.
if you look across sciences, how they operate is and the assumptions that they make and the axioms that they operate on can be pretty different. But I've looked at
Totally.
some of those reports, like the initial scientific reports, and yeah, that's what struck me is how social they are, right? But it's kind of what struck me is it's kind of implicit, right? I wonder if you can comment on that intersection with politics. 'Cause it seemed like they were if you make the inferences from what's being said, it's like, well, we have to get beyond capitalism, right? But they don't say that. Or like you were saying about we have to get beyond the nation state. I
Yeah.
mean, I think those two things are deeply intertwined, but it's kind of like you can't really come away with any other conclusion, or at least that's how I felt from my admittedly, brief and superficial encounters with some of this literature. But
Yeah.
I wondered, yeah, what you thought about that.
That's a super interesting point. There is so in my study of my part of the study of the sixth assessment report, I focused on working group one and working group two. And there is another colleague of mine, Carrie Deprich, who is based at the University of Geneva, and she focused on Working Group 3. So I'm going to draw a little bit from her research on Working Group 3. And there is a chapter in AR6 assessment, the sixth assessment, that focuses not on, I'm going to get this wrong. There's supply side economics and there's demand side economics. And one of them is dominant and one of them assumes the kind of like the status quo of continual growth. And
It's probably supply. I mean, we're more supply side now. It's more kind of neoliberal, I think. Yeah.
we'll have to I should
Research
sorry,
that.
Carrie. I know I was just like editing your thing on this, but yeah, so all that to say, there are some areas. Yeah, you have to really like read between the lines, right? Like you have to read between the
exactly, yeah.
lines and you have to sort of see how things get couched in the parlance of the IPCC. So one of the ways things will get couched is in terms of climate resilient development. So what is climate resilient development? And then you can start doing a sort of a citation search, right? Of like linking back. And there are political ecologists, right, who have contributed to this discussion as well. So there's climate resilient development, and then there's also social transformation. And so both of those, I would say those are the kinds of concepts and vocabularies that, if you start digging into them, contain a critique of the political economy, right? And of capitalism and continual growth. Because I do think you're right that a lot of people have realized that it is continual capitalist growth that is at root of so much of what needs to change in order for us to really grapple with climate change. But, having said that, I feel like I would have to go back in and do some more research to make sure that I am actually giving you the correct pointers. But I'm pretty sure it's climate resilient development and social transformations that have kind of embedded that critique within them.
Right.
Because one of the things that IPCC authors are conscious of to greater or lesser degrees is knowing that while their underlying report, once it's complete, is just going to get accepted, right, by the governmental delegates. And that's the word, it gets accepted, which means they receive it, they acknowledge it, they say, yes, this is being completed. But then the word approved is the word that designates this process I described earlier of going line by line through the entire document of the summary for policymakers. And so IPCC authors will be aware of the fact that anything that they want to have elevated into the summary for policymakers will have to be expressed in a way that governmental delegates will find palatable, right?
Right.
And so there will be a degree of self-censorship that goes on in that process. So even if you have really robust social scientific data that says, in order to ensure that the most vulnerable populations have the greatest chance of not being devastated by climate change, we need to challenge the way that resources are distributed, right? More words to that effect. Like even if you have really robust data, like they are going to be very careful about how they present that in the summary for policymakers.
Right. Could you tell us then, maybe just to wrap things up a bit, can you, in terms of the actual follow through and the significance of once the summary for policymakers is accepted and it's taken away back to the home country of the delegates, is there any kind of follow through, enforcement? I mean, we hear about climate, targets, right? But they don't seem to have the force of law. Canada failed. We hear how Canada fails to meet its climate emissions targets, CO2 emissions targets, and so on. And it's like, oh, well.
So,
what is the actual significance, do you think, of the whole thing in a bigger picture sense?
Yeah. So the IPCC, they are only providing a summary of the science, an assessment of the science. So there's never been any kind of like they've never been tasked with enforcement or policing or follow through on the political side at all, right? Like they just simply hand over these reports. And then it's the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which then organizes the Conference of the Parties, which is the annual meeting that I mentioned earlier in which these negotiations take place. People will probably be most familiar with the Paris Agreement, from 2015. And that was seen as a big success at the time because countries acknowledged the reality of climate change, right? And they were like, okay, this is a serious issue. We do need to act on it. And so just having that acknowledgement was seen as a win by many people. But the Paris Agreement is voluntary. It was in the sense that countries would stipulate what their nationally contributed, the nationally determined contributions actually are. So while the IPCC is involved in what's called the global stocktake, which is like looking at how different countries have, performed, that there is no kind of like enforcement mechanism of this, right? But that's also beyond my particular, area of interest. Particularly, like I didn't study that, like I was more interested. So we're like interviewing authors, like, what's your experience like of writing this actual document, right? Was primarily where I was, that's what my research was like. But I know that, but can I just jump tracks for a second? Because I know Paula read some other chapters in this book. So far we've only talked about me and it's like, we're 55 minutes into this interview. And I haven't yet had this opportunity to press this button, which is this one. Just crickets, right?
I can't hear that here. Which one was it?
It was the crickets.
The crickets.
Right.
Because we were also talking about having like a snore button. Was it snoring?
Snoring.
And like a slow clap. Yeah. So I feel like I've kind of like talked myself out. But
have you though? I feel like it's a small part of the project too, right? So
it is
a very small part that's a lot bigger that you could also talk about, but that's okay.
But I also know that you did your homework. Unlike Greg.
Yeah.
You did your homework. So I want to, make sure that you have a chance to talk to the things that you found interesting about this book that aren't in my chapter.
Oh, I was going to say, are you suggesting that I didn't find your chapter interesting? There were a lot of chapters in here that caught my eye. I didn't do the full reading though, Greg. Don't worry, I didn't read the full book just yet.
Go through every chapter.
Didn't go through every chapter.
Line by line, it'll be just like the one they're putting together.
Exactly. All my side critiques in the margins, all of that. But I mean, it's up to you. Which chapter.
I think it's good because I feel like I've dominated the question asking. So.
Yeah, and every time you would jump in, I'd like, oh, yeah, I had a question too.
I know, like that's something we'll have. I mean, it's the first one,
kidding.
Right? We've got to work on.
I'm kidding, Greg. I'm kidding. You ask great questions, and also Mark is a wonderful guest because he preemptively. It's almost like we were communicating non-verbally. Like you knew when I had a question, and then you would veer in that direction to clarify things. So it was really good. Yeah.
Excellent. It's almost like we had a conversation about this stuff outside of this podcast.
Almost as though. So I don't know. Did you want to talk about preppers?
We were talking about preppers.
We were talking about preppers.
It's a super fascinating chapter.
I loved it. Well written, brilliant work. So I don't know if you want to delve into providing some people who did not read the book a little overview.
Sure. So I'm just going to look it up in my book. It is chapter 11, written by Allison Ford, and it's called Skirting the Frame, Prepping and the Conservative Politics of Climate Change. So, and I was really happy. So this is in a section of the book that I edited. And Allison, she is assistant professor at Sonoma State University in California. And she spent a huge amount of time, I can't remember exactly how long, several years, hanging out with these self-described preppers, right? Preppers, people who are like basically preparing for the end of the world as we know it, many of them, right? And so they're like highly skeptical of the systems and structures of modern society, including government, including, like the globalized trade networks, which we've all come to depend on to one degree or another. And they're just trying to create a life where they can survive as autonomous, independent units if all of society collapses, right? So if you cannot simply stroll to your local cafe to get a bagel melt, what are you going to do? You're gonna have to grow your own wheat and make your own darn bagels, right? Like, do you know what I mean?
Make them off the bagel tree. Yeah.
Exactly.
So
Grow some of those.
what I like about this chapter, I mean, I think it's super well written, and besides, it's kind of like intrinsic interest of it being, about a group of people who you don't hear about all that often, is she really gives you, I think, a very rich, the anthropological phrase, the thick description through quotes, extensive quotes from her interview subjects. And she has like a really nice way of kind of framing it, the whole package theoretically, I think. That's the intro that I would give to this chapter. But what were your thoughts on it, Paula?
Oh, I loved it. And I feel like, again, it's just a snapshot of her work because it was 4 years of ethnographic research, right? So that's pretty extensive. And I mean, I've learned a little bit about preppers, may have some insider experience on that. Previously,
is Paula a prepper?
She's a prepper.
Perhaps it would align with not my political views, but again, she points to the fact that it's not just conservatives or libertarians that are drawn to this sort of movement, right? It can be across the board. It just seems to be one of the characterizing features of those who get involved on account of the fact that, resistance to government and the idea of the government being able to address, massive environmental issues, but not associated, of course, with climate change, because that does not exist, according to the preppers.
Yeah.
So that's the thing I'm not clear on, having not done the homework.
Didn't read the chapter. Professor, can you explain this to me?
Yeah. They don't believe in climate change.
Don't believe in climate change.
So, but they believe in still like ecological collapse is coming. Or like, what are they prepping for exactly?
Yeah. So,
or does it vary?
So the way that I understand it is that they understand the potential for environmental disaster.
Yes.
Right. And they recognize that environmental disasters are like a feature and perhaps becoming more common. But they would not attribute the cause of environmental disasters to anthropogenic climate change.
Is it still anthropogenic though? Like, do they still think like that other forms of environmental disasters are in the offing and that are coming, that are of our creation? Or is it like they think a meteor is going to hit the earth and wipe us out? Or
I think it could be any number of factors too, right? But it's also their experience of some of these disasters previously that kind of warrant that understanding of this will happen, right? Or can happen and is continuously more likely to happen, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, they may be right. I mean, climate change gets all of the attention, but it's actually just one environment. I'm just going
to read you like one sentence from this book, page 95. So this is in a section subtitled, How Do Preppers Feel About Climate Change? Right near the top of page 95, she says, the visibility of disasters around the world, combined with personal experiences of the precarity of extended networks of goods and services, leave preppers feeling vulnerable. Yeah, so, really briefly, that is an overview of Alison Ford's chapter, which is so excellent, I think, prepping and the conservative politics of climate change, because it came out of her in-depth ethnography of spending so much time with these people.
Yeah, and the book as a whole, even though, I haven't actually read it yet, skimming it and hearing you describe it, it sounds like there's lots of really interesting takes. So
yeah, man, there's like 37. There's 37 chapters, and there's 37 chapters, and like there's 37 unique voices, right? Like we tried to make it as an editor. I mean, we were trying to make it as readable as possible. So we're trying to encourage authors to frame it not as like a typical academic text and trying to make it like less jargony, less specialized, more for a kind of like a novice audience. And I would say that there's, a variety of writing styles, let's say, in here, but, so some are going to be more approachable, I think, than others. and others are may presume that people have a higher degree of knowledge already before coming into the chapter, but they're all excellent, I think. Lots.
Great. And the book again is Climate, Science, and Society, a Primer,
Yes.
edited by Zeke Baker, Tamar Law, our very own Mark Vardy, and Stefan Zer. Is that how you pronounce it?
Stephen Zier. Yep.
Okay. Yes, Stephen Zer.
And he is the guy who kind of masterminded the whole thing. Paula, did you have your notes? Did you have any questions?
I had extensive notes. Well, just things to talk about, right? I think we also had our private chat without Greg prior to
Nice.
talking about these ideas about this hierarchy of knowledge again that leads into that disputable what constitutes science and the relationship between science and politics, but in particular that notion of the scientific elite in that chapter, right, on the preppers. So
the hierarchy of knowledge, was that in the Alison Ford chapter?
no, I just identifying that as kind of a bit of a thread, kind of cross-referencing chapters in terms of what constitute knowledge, with the preppers understanding, experiential knowledge and their kind of resistance toward climate change, but still acknowledging, there's these sort of environmental disasters that we can cope with versus, thinking about indigenous knowledges and kind of how that needs to be an influence or considered within this context of the climate emergency.
Yeah, I think it's super interesting, like to think about like experience, like a sort of phenomenological experience, right? And like thinking about how people gain knowledge in their everyday life through their kind of continual observations and interactions, not only with, each other and like forms of media and whatnot that comprise the human world, but also like the non-human world, right? Like, so if you think about like how we build up knowledge of the environment through like interactions, and and this is something that in the urban spaces, we tend to be a little bit more sheltered maybe from the earth in a particular way. But like say a chapter like Candace Collison's chapter 3, Rethinking Our Histories and Our Relations with Climate Change. Yeah, she is writing there about the impacts of colonialism and the relationships between colonialism and climate change, and then also about indigenous knowledge, right? And talking about relations and how indigenous knowledge, and I'm not an indigenous person myself, I'm not an indigenous expert myself. So, I have no kind of authority over this subject matter myself. That's why I like reading works like Candace's so much, because she can write about this material with such nuance and complexity. But she talks about how indigenous peoples gain knowledge through their relations with the natural, what we might call the natural environment or the more than human environment. So she says, for example, on page 22, many indigenous people consider non-humans to be relatives or kin, and indigenous systems of knowledge are a result of thousands of years of data, experimentation, and adaptation alongside one another. And so, so that I think that really, is a good way of getting to this point that you're talking about, that we also see in the preppers chapter, that what people take to be kind of real for them is some that accrues out of experience. And in no way do I want to put indigenous peoples and preppers on the same kind of like platform, but to say that I think it really requires us to then start paying attention to the specificity. And this goes back to the larger point about science and technology studies. At the end, it really requires us to pay attention to the specificity of how we know what it is we think we know, right? And if you go into, the climate denialist kind of movements and start tracing out pathways through which knowledge is accrued there, you quite quickly bump into fossil fuel corporations and the public relations companies that they have hired and the strategists that they have hired and the astroturf groups that they have hired to cast doubt on climate change, right? And that's part and parcel of this network through which knowledge is built in those networks. Whereas if you go into indigenous knowledge and you start tracing out the networks, then you get into generations and generations and generations of like lived experience and lived history that of living with like the non-human and relating to it in a way that yeah, is kind of outside of science in its own way of understanding, and it's got its own cosmology, but it's not in contradiction to science, right? Like, so sometimes there's like these kind of parallel worlds. And this actually, I heard Nathan Obed, who is now the leader of ITK, which is the Inuit National Organization. And if I tried to pronounce it without having it written in front of me, I would mangle it. It's like Inuit Taprit Contamini, or something like that. Anyway, Nathan Obed, he is a brilliant speaker and I think a brilliant leader. I think he should be prime minister. Anyways, I saw him speak when he was giving a talk at a conference that was about Arctic science, right? And he was saying how, from Arctic indigenous perspectives, it's almost like there's two worlds because you'll have all these academic scientists who will go up to the Arctic to study Arctic change and like the impacts of climate change in the Arctic. And you also have Arctic indigenous peoples like the Inuit who are living with these changes and understanding that from their own perspective. But he said that they're almost like these two parallel universes that don't intersect, right? And there he got into a really interesting discussion and nuance, yeah, about these similarities between a scientific mindset and kind of a militaristic mindset of kind of occupation and extraction, as opposed to indigenous ways of relating. So all that to say, you have like these somewhat parallel, but non-contradictory, right? Like 'cause there's a lot of, anyways, that perhaps opens up a whole other can of worms because then to talk about one of the, yeah, I got to stop it there, guys, because if I didn't stop it there, I would start talking about, well, what is the relation between indigenous knowledge in the Arctic and scientific knowledge in the Arctic, and how are they actually brought together in ways that appear to give credence to indigenous knowledge whilst actually subjugating it still, right?
Right.
And that because that you'll often get like this talk, and I'm way now beyond what Candace is writing about in her chapter, but it's kind of related because you'll often get talk about the inclusion of indigenous knowledge alongside scientific knowledge, but it's often done in a way that doesn't actually incorporate like the more profound kinds of insights about living with Earth, you know.
Yeah, well, I found a similar thing when I was looking at salmon farming, that the way regulatory science and DFO paid a lot of lip service to indigenous knowledge and so on, but it was in this kind of superficial, romanticized, noble savage, if you will, in quotes, kind of way, and that the actual profound, when it came down to actually meaningful inclusion, it was not there.
Yeah,
at all.
because exactly, because and that's often because it's assumed that science is the master frame and that
Yeah.
indigenous knowledge should complement science.
Exactly.
Whereas
Yeah.
that indigenous experience is actually more relevant to like territories and belonging to Earth, right? So instead of like putting indigenous knowledge alongside science, I think we should be using it to challenge concepts of the nation state and sovereignty and citizenship that we have inherited through Western society, right? So that
Yes,
kind of
well,
goes
for sure.
goes
Yeah.
back to the point that I was trying to make in my chapter.
But also, like, I found you can set up, like, within administrative kind of science, these impossible kind of like loops where you're never able to, like catch-22s, where science is never able to meet its own standards of proof, which admittedly fluctuate, right? That's another way that like indigenous knowledge gets excluded, which again goes to the actual hegemony of even a certain particular kind of positivist notion of Western science, which is employed when it's convenient, right? It's like, well, we can't have regulations because you haven't actually, proved to a degree, to a standard of proof that doesn't actually work in an ecological context, right? While all the time like paying lip service to, the importance of indigenous knowledge and so on. But yeah, you can cut all this if you like. Is Paula still there? Have you?
I am still there. No.
She's-
It's so hard to determine too. It's like, do I jump in now?
Jump
No?
in.
Jump in now?
Jump in.
Do
If you have the
Well,
impulse to jump in, jump in.
Because I liked how you directed that because, again, talking about that hierarchies of that's precisely what I was trying to convey is that, the different ways of knowing, but also from an indigenous perspective, as conveyed within that text, the idea that, knowing and being in relation to the environment, kind of that's what constitutes knowledge, right? On an epistemological level, it's more so the connectedness, the relationality to the world, to the more than human, that constitutes that knowledge. That is, again, it's so different than that so-called, we'll say, the scientific perspective.
Yeah. 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 I wish,
Yeah.
I mean, we could do like a whole lecture on it. We could do like a whole course on this, right? Like
Yeah.
about like science and ways of knowing. And I'm just, like thinking about how there's going again to Bruno Latour, there's a great diagram that I really like in his chapter called Circulating Reference in the book Pandora's Hope. And it's got two triangles that are overlaid, two sort of like directional arrows. And the implication of this diagram is that the science gains power by reducing the complexity of the messiness of the world into something that is small and transportable. And then that small transportable representation of the complexity of the and messiness of the world can be translated into so many like different locales, and that's kind of like one of the way in which power operates. And so indigenous knowledge is not granted the same power by Western society, right? Because like indigenous knowledge is typically seen as being place-based, as being specific to this place, as if it cannot be universalized. Whereas science, in its actual origin, is just as place-based as indigenous knowledge, but yet we assume that it can be detached from that place and travel into other locations, right? So is that kind of, and so that is one of the features I think of this hierarchy of knowledge that you're talking about.
Back to that whole theme of STS and what the actual purpose of understanding science is and how knowledge is produced.
Yeah, in power.
In power.
Thanks, everybody, for listening to this amazing episode of Green Justice, featuring me, Mark Vardy, not only as co-host, but as special guest star. So thank you very much, Paula and Greg, for your kind attention and your questions. This has been a lot of fun, and it's made me think about this in a whole new way, and bring the book alive in a whole new way for me. So thank you.
Well, thank you.
Thank
Thanks
you,
for
Mark.
your, totalizing role, assuming both guest and host. And that's an interesting, reflection, on the scientific method in itself, right? Subject and object in one of the discourse and the inquiry. So thanks, Mark. Thanks, Paula.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. we should have just like asked him one question and just depart.
Yeah.
let him take on the full total rules.
That's right. Yeah.
I could just generate.
He should have just interviewed himself. Right. Why were we even here?
I don't know.
I think there's like an AI avatar somewhere that I could just, get to speak. Right? Isn't there? I could do this all through AI.
Make it your voice and just talk to yourself
We don't
the
even need
entire
to be
time.
here. We could just feed AI this book and say, have a conversation between three people who have read this book.
Yeah.
And then it would.
Yeah, I know. Oh, well.
Oh, well.
It wouldn't be very good, though, I don't think.
Probably
Nothing like this.
Nothing like
come on.
this.
Yeah.